Uh, we are with the professor and Dr. Rita Irwin, and she is an artist, researcher, and teacher deeply committed to the artist and education. She is professor of art education in the Department of Curriculum and Pedagogy at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. And between another project, she also developed the research about orthography, and will be about this research we will talk today. And dear Professor Rita, thank you very much for your presence. And I'd like to ask about the orthography and a short part of this important research. Then I would ask you about the integrate with the artist, research, and teacher identities. Consider this research, if you can talk about it for us.
So I think to talk about it, I want to convey my first experiences as a university professor working with graduate students, because this is where it began for me. So when I finished my PhD, I moved away to another university, and then I returned to UBC a few years later. And during that time, I was very interested in action research, which I think probably has some affinity with some of Paulo Freire's work, where wanting people at the grassroots to be involved and to show relevance with what they're doing. And so when I started working with graduate students here, I created a small project within a course that I was teaching to art education students, asking them to do a small action research project. And what really struck me in that course was, even though it was around them formulating a topic of interest to them and to researching that, they really needed to use their own artistic or creative practices as they were thinking about their own research and how it involved education, which really struck me, because at that time, this was it was about 28 years ago, almost 30 years ago. Art practices were not considered a part of research, right? But it was very interesting to me that the art educators needed to do some art as part of their thinking through the process, etc. And so, yes, I decided, yes, we'll embrace that and we'll do that. And what really struck me in that process was that it made a huge difference to them. It made a huge difference to how they conceptualized their work, what they learned from it, but even how they did it, because it became really important that they were not just art teachers, and therefore pedagogy was important and anything educational was important. They were art teachers, so art was important. And so any kind of inquiry or any kind of research needed to take that into account. So one reason I wanted to share that with you is this really comes from my practice of working with art teachers, is that this is really a part of them. It's a part of who they are. It's how they think, and it's how they think and understand the world. So that made a big impression on me, to the point where at the end of that first semester when I was trying that, some of the students said they wanted to continue. Of course, the course was finishing. And I said, well, maybe we could continue for a little while longer, a smaller group of us. And so I was able to get a little bit of research funding. And we continued. I thought it would continue for one semester. it ended up that group, and there were six students, stayed with me for 5 years. And in that time, we met monthly or more often to read together, to make art and share our art. And the whole thing that it was around at that time, we were all very interested in feminist issues around gender, and how was gender being taken up in arts classrooms or art discussions, or how were we addressing questions around gender and gender identity. So everybody had a different question or a different emphasis, but when we came together, we shared those discussions, we shared those topics and learned from one another. We put on one exhibition a year, and we wrote, I don't know, 3, 4, or 5 articles together, or chapters. So it was a very productive time. And they were all teachers, school teachers. None of them, they were all master's students. And it was a very generative time. And so that was where a lot of my learning came from, was that I saw the importance for, as part of professional development, is for art teachers to be thinking about all 3 identities. Eventually, that group evolved into a PhD group, not with the same people, but eventually more people at my university wanted to be a part of the discussion. And then it became more of a doctoral discussion. And then I eventually moved more to a doctoral group. And then that group, we really took up more of the theoretical ideas around the possibilities. And then, so that was in the early 2000s. And then everything has kind of moved since then. So since then I've had probably over 20 PhDs finish using artography. And there's quite a few people in various parts of the world using artography. And in fact, right now I have an international research group with about 5 or 6 countries where we're working, doing some work around artography. And the one idea in that one that is common across everybody is that we're proposing some processes dealing with walking. There's a lot of artists now who are using walking as their medium, and so that's kind of like the one thing we have in common. We're each taking it up differently. But I want to get back to the quote you have here on the chat box. Let me just have a look at it more carefully. Let me say a little bit, let me speak a bit more to what you have in the text.
Oh, please.
So I think it's really important. You know, artography has the slashes, right?
Yes.
A/R/T. So when that was originally kind of conceptualized, it was to not just recognize art and graphy.
Okay.
That's one thing, art and graphy. So there's any kind of art form and the writing, the discourse that goes with that, whatever scholarship goes with that. There's also this idea that simultaneously there's these identities. And I would also say that when it was started, it was around identities, the idea that we're all artist educators who are also researchers. But it's also the processes. So it's also art making, researching, and teaching, learning, which is really important because more in contemporary theories, there's more of an emphasis on the doing and the making and less on identities. So there's more on how we're handling materials, for instance, materiality and the immateriality of things. And so it's more about the doing than it is about us as humans. However, if we're thinking about us as humans, to be very practical, I have met a lot of art educators who struggle to continue doing their art because the stresses of education are so great.
Yeah.
Right? However, if you think about that you can be doing your art as part of your educational practice, whether it's with your students or how you understand your settings or how you understand your practices, or that you can be doing your art alongside your practice, however that might be conceptualized, then you become more generous with yourself, and you realize that you can actually do both in some ways, or find room for both. Because it's less about, are you a big name artist, and more about how is art a part of who you are as a person and of your own professional practice. And so therefore, yes, as art educators, we can be integrating all those, our own art practices, our educational thinking, etc. And in doing that, we can put some systems in place, or rhythms in place, perhaps, or some form of evidence, whether it's documentation or some way that we're keeping track of what we're doing. So in other words, we're starting to put the foundations in place for inquiry and research. And in doing that, then we start to think more deeply about our art and about our teaching and learning, about our art making and teaching and learning. And once we start doing that, then we start to think more deeply across all of them. And then, of course, that's when reading about this for ourselves and for others, or writing about it and sharing it with others and discussing it with others, becomes really important. So communities of practice have always been important to me. So it's not just about me, but it's who we're working with. So going back to that first group, it was the working with others, alongside others, that was so important. And learning through their art practices, their teaching and learning practices, much as my own, made a big difference on how we integrated that. And then simultaneously to that, then one begins to realize that, as that quote says, we start to create knowledge, we start to create action, and in fact, we also create how we understand our senses, how we understand our perceptions of things. We start to create ideas. So we realize that we're creators of knowledge. And so we're involved in all of those things. And the aesthetic experience of how we interpret, I should say, or perceive or create, becomes very essential to what we're doing. So yes, the intellect, feeling, and practice are all important there. There's a lot in that quote that you gathered there.
I'm really thrilled to hear you about this, because it's about, I read in your tests and your email when you wrote me when I needed to think more about it, and I'm had to hear this with you in front of me. It's so important.
So good to talk with both of you.
Oh, it was perfect for me. Thank you very much.